The moment Pope Leo XIV saw the handwriting on the envelope, 62 years of carefully constructed peace shattered like glass. The letter sat innocuously on his mahogany desk among the morning's diplomatic correspondence. But something about those trembling, aged script marks made his breath catch in his throat, a recognition so deep it bypassed his mind and struck directly at his heart. The golden light of early June bathed the Vatican in a quiet stillness that morning. It was June 3rd, exactly. 26 days after his historic election, and St. Peter's Square was already beginning to fill with pilgrims from every corner of the world. Their colorful banners fluttered under the rising sun as families and priests, elderly couples and children all gathered with hopeful anticipation for the Wednesday general audience. Inside the papal apartments, the morning routine was underway. Staff moved discreetly through the hallways. Liturgical garments had been pressed and prepared, and a silver crucifix gleamed softly on the prayer table near the Pope's bed. Yet, despite the familiar rhythm of the Vatican's daily schedule, something about this morning felt different. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Post nearly 70 years ago in the suburbs of Chicago, stood at the window watching the crowd assemble. He held his glasses in one hand, the other gently resting on the back of the small wooden chair where he had prayed his morning rosary. His face, marked with the wisdom of decades, looked serene, but his eyes betrayed a certain distraction. It was not the crowd outside that preoccupied him. It was the envelope sitting silently on his desk. The letter had arrived the previous day, its faded postmark reading Milano. It had been delivered through the ordinary diplomatic channels. But unlike the dozens of documents and greetings received daily, this one had caught the attention of the Pope's secretary at once. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, aged, unfamiliar, and deeply personal. "Your Holiness," said Cardinal Joseph Toretti, handing the envelope to the Holy Father with unusual solemnity. "This letter. It seems very personal. I thought you should see it immediately." Robert took the envelope in his hands. Something in the way his fingers trembled gave away what his lips could not say. He recognized the name, a name that hadn't passed before. His eyes in over half a century, a name he thought he would never see again. The weight of decades seemed to rest inside that fragile paper. With careful precision, Pope Leo XIV sat down at his desk and opened the envelope. 3 handwritten pages on plain stationery, the ink slightly smudged. His fingers touched the words before his eyes could absorb them. "My son Robert, if you are truly my son, and I know I have no right to say these words, I saw the news of your election on television, and I wept. Not from joy, but from shame." The Pope stopped reading and closed his eyes. A wave of memories hit him like the sudden crash of surf. He was 7 again, watching his father walk out the front door in October 1962. No warning, no explanation. Just absence. The sound of that door closing had never truly left him. He turned back to the letter. How can a man who abandoned his son ever claim pride in the man that boy became, thanks to everyone but himself? Robert set the letter down for a moment and leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. He clasped his hands and exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady his heartbeat. The Vatican study faded around him, replaced by the memory of a small Chicago apartment where autumn light filtered through thin curtains. He could see himself as a child, standing in pajamas by the living room window, watching a man with dark hair load a suitcase into the trunk of a blue sedan. The boy had pressed his small palms against the cold glass, breath fogging the window as he whispered, "Papa, don't go." But his father never looked back, never waved, never hesitated. Young Robert had stayed at that window long after the car disappeared, down Maple Street, waiting for it to return. His mother, Margaret, had found him there hours later, still in his pajamas, still watching the empty street. "Where did Papa go?" he had asked. "I don't know, sweetheart," she had answered, and those 4 words became the soundtrack of his childhood. The letter continued, "You grew up without me, raised by your saintly mother, Margaret, and your grandmother, Rose. They made you the man you are today. I fled. I ran from my responsibilities because I was afraid of not being enough, afraid I would become like my own father." Tears now rolled freely down the Pope's cheeks. He made no effort to stop them. The letter described how Louis had lived. For decades, working in a modest furniture workshop outside Milan, he had never remarried. He had no other family, He lived alone with nothing but the memories of the child he left behind. "I don't ask for your forgiveness," the letter said. "I know some wounds never heal." Pope Leo XIV pressed the pages to his chest, his heart aching not just as a pope, but as a son. The tears kept coming. He did not speak. Only silence filled the study until Cardinal Torretti re-entered the room. Sensing something out of place, the cardinal paused at the door, watching the pope in stillness. "Your Holiness," he said gently. Robert slowly turned, still holding the letter. His voice was soft but resolute. "Joseph," he said, using the cardinal's first name, something he rarely did. "How do we respond to someone who hurt us deeply, but who now asks sincerely to be forgiven?" The cardinal, wise and faithful, came closer. His reply was simple and sure. "As Christ taught us, Your Holiness, with mercy and with love." The pope nodded. He wiped his face with the linen handkerchief from his cassock, but instead of speaking, he stood and walked toward the door. "Come with me, Joseph. I need to pray." They made their way through the quiet corridors to the Pope's private chapel, a small sanctuary hidden away from the public spaces of the Vatican. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the marble floor. The tabernacle glowed softly in the sanctuary lamp's amber light. Pope Leo XIV knelt before the altar, his white cassock pooling around him like spilled cream. Cardinal Torretti took his place in a pew behind, respecting the sacred solitude of his pontiff's struggle. For long minutes, Robert knelt in silence. His hands were folded, his head bowed, but his mind was a tempest. Every homily he had ever preached about forgiveness seemed to echo in the chapel's stillness. Every time he had counseled a parishioner to let go and let God, now felt like hollow words spoken by a man who had never truly been tested. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for 62 years I have carried this wound. I have built my priesthood around it, shaped my understanding of abandonment through it. And now you ask me to forgive the man who created it." He lifted his eyes to the crucifix above the altar. Christ's wounded hands seemed to reach toward him across the centuries. "I have preached mercy," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "I have told countless souls that no sin is beyond your grace. But this is my Father. This is the man who taught me that love could disappear without warning." Cardinal Torretti shifted slightly in his pew, but remained silent. "Show me how," the Pope whispered. "Show me how to forgive when the wound still bleeds." The answer came not as a voice from heaven, but as a quiet certainty that settled in Pope Leo XIV's chest like morning light breaking through clouds. He remained kneeling for another 10 minutes, then rose with the deliberate movements of a man who had made a decision that would change everything. "Joseph," he said, turning to Cardinal Torretti, "arrange a discreet visit to Milan. No announcement, no public attention, just a son visiting his father." The cardinal's eyes widened. "But Your Holiness, your schedule is full," and the security the Pope raised his hand gently. "There are moments in life, Joseph, when God's schedule takes precedence. Over ours, this man has waited 62 years. He will not wait one more day." Within hours, the papal apartments buzzed with quiet activity. Cardinal Torretti worked with Vatican security to arrange an unmarked vehicle and minimal escort. The Pope's official schedule was quietly rearranged. Private retreat would cover his absence. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Pope Leo XIV was going to see his father for the first time in more than 6 decades. That same afternoon, a modest black car departed the Vatican through a side gate. Inside sat Pope Leo XIV, dressed in a simple black suit and Roman collar rather than his papal whites. He watched the Italian countryside roll by through the window, his expression reflective, prayerful. Next to him, Cardinal Torretti remained quiet, respecting the sacredness of this journey. The silence stretched for miles before the Pope finally spoke. "You know, Joseph," he said after a long pause, "for all these years I have preached forgiveness. I've told thousands of people to forgive those who hurt them most." He paused, watching a field of sunflowers blur past. "Today, God is giving me the chance to live the very words I've spoken." The cardinal looked at him with deep admiration, but said nothing. As they crossed into Lombardy, the Pope's hands began to tremble slightly. He clasped them together in his lap, trying to steady himself. The letter was folded in his breast pocket, worn soft from repeated readings. He could recite every word by heart now, especially the closing lines. If your great shepherd's heart has room for an old man full of sorrow, I would be grateful to see you just once more. If not, I understand. I will respect your silence. The car moved steadily toward Milan, carrying a pope who, for this afternoon, didn't feel like a spiritual leader or a man of global stature. He felt like a child, finally on his way to meet the man who had disappeared all those years ago. The car pulled off the highway, weaving through the streets of a quiet Milan suburb. Narrow alleys, modest apartment buildings, flowering balconies, it all felt far from the grandeur of Vatican marble. To Robert, it felt more real than any palace. When the car came to a stop outside a pale yellow building, he recognized the address from the letter. He looked up at the third-floor window. A curtain moved slightly, as if someone had been watching. His hands trembled as he stepped out of the car. He hadn't been Robert in years, yet now, with every step toward the building, he felt the boy inside him, stirring the child who had waited, hoped, prayed. The building had no elevator. Cardinal Toretti followed quietly as they began ascending the staircase. With each step, memories returned, some joyful, some painful. He remembered his father's laughter once, the smell of sawdust on his clothes, the way he used to carry Robert. On his shoulders, it was not all absence. There had been a time, however brief, when love was real. When they reached the third floor, they stopped in front of the door marked Post. Robert took a deep breath. The cardinal stepped back, giving space. The Pope raised his hand, hesitated only for a moment, then knocked. There was no need for a second knock. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was, older, frailer, his frame stooped with time, but those deep blue eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes Robert had inherited, the same eyes he had seen in the mirror all his life. Louis Marius Post didn't speak at first. His lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, with a voice that cracked like old wood, he whispered. Robert the Pope answered with a single word, equally quiet, equally full, Papa. The moment hovered between them, weightless and heavy at once. Then Pope Leo XIV took a step forward, and the past began to heal. The door remained ajar, as if time itself had been waiting for this very moment to step aside. They stood face to face, the man who had once been his entire world, and the man whose absence had carved a deep wound into the very fabric of his childhood. Louis Marius Post, now 92, looked fragile, almost weightless, like a ghost summoned by memory, but he was real. The scent of old books and wood polish drifted from the apartment behind him. Would you like to come in? Louis asked, almost afraid of his own voice. Robert nodded, stepping across the threshold. He didn't walk like a pope entering a room, but like a son returning to a home he never knew. Behind him, Cardinal Toretti paused, then waited near the door without a word, respecting the intimacy of what was unfolding. The apartment was small and modest, far from the splendor of the Vatican, yet warm in a way that made the heart ache. There were two worn armchairs by a window, a tiny kitchen table covered with a linen cloth, and on the walls dozens of newspaper clippings and photographs. One by one they caught Pope Leo XIV's eye, his first Mass, his ordination, his elevation to cardinal, and finally the image of him stepping out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica after being elected Pope. "You kept everything," Robert whispered. "I couldn't be there," Louis said, his voice trembling. "So I kept what I could." Robert walked slowly toward a frame that held a photograph of him at age 22, smiling beside a group of seminary classmates. "I used to wonder if you ever thought of me," he said softly. "If I was just a chapter you closed and never looked." "Back on, I thought of you every day," Louis replied, lowering himself into one of the chairs. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I heard the name Robert." The Pope remained standing, glancing again at the collage of his life displayed on the walls of a man he hadn't spoken to since 1962. His heart was heavy, his thoughts jumbled, so many emotions rising all at once: grief, confusion, sorrow, even guilt. He turned toward his father. "Why didn't you come back?" Louis closed his eyes for a moment, then looked up at his son with the expression of a man who had lived too long with one single regret. "I didn't believe I was worth coming back," he said. "That's not your decision to make," Robert replied quietly. I know that now, but back then, I was 25. I was scared. I had lost my job. I started drinking. I was failing as a husband, as a father, as a man. I'd look at your mother, Margaret, so strong, so full of grace, and I felt like a shadow beside her. You were just a boy, a beautiful, bright boy, I thought. Maybe you'd have a better life if I wasn't part of it. The Pope sat down slowly in the opposite chair. The air between them seemed to hold the weight of all that had been left unsaid. "You didn't even say goodbye," he said. His voice was calm, but his hands were clenched together. "You didn't explain. You didn't send a letter. You just vanished." Louis nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I left you with questions I didn't have the courage to answer. I told myself I would return when I became a better man," Louis continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I boarded a ship to Europe, thinking I'd work, rebuild myself, and someday knock on your door. But every year that passed, it got harder. The shame grew. I thought you hated me. I prayed for you," Robert said, "every night from the age of 7 until now. I asked God to protect you. I told him that even though I didn't understand, I still loved you." Louis covered his face with his hands, sobbing softly. His body shook with each breath, like a man finally crumbling under the weight of a secret held too long. "I don't deserve this," he said through the tears. "I don't deserve you sitting here. I don't deserve to even speak your name." Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. He unfolded it carefully and held it up. "You wrote this, didn't you?" Louis nodded. "Then let me read one part. Again, because it matters to me." He cleared his throat and began. "I don't ask for your forgiveness, because I know some wounds never heal. I only wanted you to know, not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you." He lowered the page. "That wound, ... it never did heal, not completely, but it's still alive, and that means it can still feel." He reached across the space between them and placed the letter gently on the table. "My mother told me something when I was very young," she said. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to remember with love. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." Louis looked up at him, his eyes shining with disbelief. "You're saying you forgive me?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, children were playing in a small courtyard, their laughter echoing from below, innocent and full of life. He watched them for a moment, then turned around. "I'm saying I'm trying," he said. "Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. Once it's a path, and I'm willing to walk it with you if you are." "I am," Louis said, rising to his feet with effort. More than anything, they looked at each other not as Pope and penitent, not as leader and follower, but as father and son. Broken, scarred, human. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of longing, of memory, of grace. Robert finally stepped forward. He opened his arms. Louis didn't hesitate. He collapsed into them, weeping freely, his frail body clinging to the son he thought he had lost forever. "I'm sorry," he whispered again and again. "I'm so sorry." And in that embrace, the wound that had remained open for more than 60 years began, at last, to close. When they finally separated, Robert kept his hands on his father's shoulders. "Come with me," he said softly. "Where?" "Home. To Rome. There's so much I want to show you." The following morning, Louis Marius Post awoke in a guest room overlooking the Vatican gardens, sunlight streaming through windows that faced the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then it came back to him: the journey from Milan, the quiet entrance through Vatican gates, his son's gentle hand guiding him through marble corridors he had only seen in photographs. "I am in the Vatican," he whispered to himself, as if saying it aloud might make it real. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Cardinal Toretti entered with a warm smile, carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Signor Post. His Holiness thought you might prefer to eat quietly this first morning." Louis sat up slowly, his joints stiff with age. "Please, just call me Louis. Or Thomas, that's what they called me in Milan." "Thomas it is," the Cardinal replied, setting the tray on a small table by the window. "The Holy Father asks if you'd join him for a walk in the gardens when you're ready. No schedule, no hurry." An hour later, Thomas found himself walking beside His son, along paths lined with ancient olive trees and flowering rose bushes. Vatican staff moved discreetly in the distance, tending to their duties, but the gardens felt like a world apart from the grand ceremonies and public audiences. "Every morning I walk here," Pope Leo XIV said, his hands clasped behind his back. "Not as Pope, but as Robert. It's where I remember who I am beneath all of this." He gestured toward the white cassock and PayPal ring. Thomas looked around in wonder. "I used to imagine where you lived, what your days were like. I pictured you in grand halls, surrounded by important people. I never imagined ... peace like this." They paused beside a fountain where water trickled softly over weathered stone. "The halls exist," Robert said with a gentle smile, "but this is where I pray, where I think, where I miss the people I love." "You missed me?" Thomas asked, his voice uncertain. "Every day," Robert replied simply. "Especially here. Especially in the quiet moments when the Pope becomes just a son again." They continued walking, past gardeners who nodded respectfully but didn't intrude. Thomas noticed how his son moved with purpose but without hurry, acknowledging each person they encountered with genuine warmth. "The staff," Thomas observed, "they look at you with such not fear but reverence." "I hope they see love," Robert said. "That's what I try to give them. What I learned from watching Mama and Grandma Rose after you left. They showed me that authority without tenderness is just noise." As they rounded a corner, suddenly, before them stretched a view of Rome's ancient skyline, church domes and terracotta rooftops glowing in the morning sun. "This is your world now," he said, awe in his voice. "No," Robert corrected gently, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "This is our world now, Papa, if you'll have it." 3 days had passed since Thomas arrived at the Vatican, and with each sunrise, the bond between father and son deepened. They shared quiet meals, walked the gardens in comfortable silence, and spoke of everything except the one question that hung in the air like morning mist. That evening, Pope Leo XIV sat in his private study. Thomas in the chair across from him, both men sipping tea as candlelight flickered against ancient books. Cardinal Torretti had joined them, his presence now as natural as breathing in their small circle of trust. "There's something I need to tell you both," Robert said finally, setting down his cup. "Tomorrow is the Wednesday General Audience. Thousands will gather in St. Peter's Square, and millions more will watch around the world." Thomas nodded, unsure. Where this was leading, "I want to tell them about us," the Pope continued. "About what happened, about forgiveness and second chances, and the mercy that brought you home." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of an ancient clock. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his tea. "You want to tell the world about me?" he asked. "About what I did?" "I want to tell them about what God did," Robert replied gently. "Through us, despite us. I want them to see that no wound is too deep for healing, no separation too far for love to bridge." Cardinal Torretti leaned forward. "Your Holiness, the exposure, the questions from media?" "Let them come," the Pope said with quiet certainty. "The world is hungry for real stories, Joseph. Not theology, not doctrine. Stories that bleed and breathe and show that grace isn't just a word we say at Mass." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at his weathered hands. When he looked up, his eyes were wet but determined. "Will you ... Will you be ashamed to have me beside you?" Robert's response was immediate. "Papa, I've never been prouder of anything in my life than I am of this moment. Of you having the courage to write that letter, of us sitting here together. But the people ... they'll judge me. They'll say I don't deserve to be forgiven." And that, Robert said with a gentle smile, is exactly why they need to hear our story. Because none of us deserve grace. That's what makes it grace. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're not just inviting me to stand beside you. You're inviting me to stand before God's people and say, 'I failed, but love found me anyway.'" "Yes," Robert whispered. "Will you do it?" The old man looked out the window at the dome of St. Peter's, illuminated against the Roman night. Somewhere in that square tomorrow, thousands would gather, seeking hope, seeking healing, seeking signs that redemption was more than just a beautiful word. "I'll do it," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his tears. "For them, for us, for every father who thinks it's too late to come home." Cardinal Torretti smiled, recognizing the hand of providence in this moment. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "the world will witness a miracle." The morning sun rose slowly over St. Peter's Basilica, casting golden light across the vast square where thousands of white chairs had been arranged in perfect rows. Pilgrims from every continent began arriving before dawn, some clutching rosaries, others holding small flags or images of Pope Leo XIV. There was an electric anticipation in the air. Though none in the crowd could have imagined what they were about to witness, in the papal apartments, Thomas stood before a mirror, adjusting the simple dark suit that Vatican staff had provided. His hand shook slightly as he straightened his tie. He had never faced so many people at once, had never been the center of such attention. But when Robert appeared in the doorway, dressed in his papal whites, Thomas felt a calm settle over him. "Are you ready, Papa?" the Pope asked softly. Thomas nodded. "With you beside me, I think I can face anything." They made their way through the corridors toward the balcony that overlooked the square. Through the windows, Thomas caught glimpses of the enormous crowded sea of faces stretching to the colonnade and beyond. His breath caught so many people, he whispered. "All children of God," Robert replied. "Just like us, just like you." When they reached the entrance to the papal balcony, the sound hit them like a wave applause, cheers, cries of "Viva il Papa," echoing off the ancient stones. Pope Leo XIV stepped into view first, raising his hand in blessing as cameras flashed and flags waved across the square. Thomas waited in the shadows, his heart pounding. Through the doorway, he could see his son taking his place at the papal throne, beginning the traditional greetings in multiple languages. But then, after welcoming pilgrims from around the world, the Pope's voice took on a different tone. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began, "today I want to speak to you, not as your Pope, but as a son." A hush fell over the square. Somewhere in that crowd, a baby cried softly. But otherwise, 30,000 people listened in perfect silence. "This week, something extraordinary happened in my life. Something deeply personal, but something I believe speaks to the heart of our faith." He paused, his eyes finding the doorway where Thomas waited. 3 days ago, I was reunited with a man I hadn't seen since I was 7 years old. A man whose absence shaped much of who I became. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That man," the Pope continued, his voice growing stronger, "was my father." Gasps echoed across the square. In that moment, Thomas knew there was no turning back. He stepped forward into the light, and 30,000 people saw grace made visible. The world's response was unlike anything the Vatican had ever witnessed. Within hours of Pope Leo XIV's public embrace of his father, social media platforms overflowed with videos of the moment. The image of two men, one in papal white, one in simple black, holding each other as 30,000 people watched in stunned silence, became the most shared photograph in Vatican history. But it wasn't the numbers that moved Robert, it was the letters. They began arriving the next morning by the hundreds, then thousands. Cardinal Toretti found himself coordinating extra staff just to manage the unprecedented volume of mail flooding Vatican City. Letters came in dozens of languages, from every continent, each one carrying a story of broken relationships and newfound hope. Pope Leo XIV insisted on reading as many as possible personally. That evening, he sat in his study with Thomas, both men overwhelmed by the human response to their story. "Listen to this one," Papa Robert said, unfolding a letter written on hospital stationery. "It's from a nurse in São Paulo. Your Holiness, I watched your audience with my father, who has been in our ICU for 3 weeks. We haven't spoken in 15 years because of things I said in anger. When I saw you forgive your father, I took his hand and said, 'Papa, I'm sorry.' He squeezed back. The doctors say his recovery began that moment." Thomas wiped his eyes. "This ... because of us, because of grace working through us," Robert corrected gently. He picked up another letter. "This one's from a teenager in Mumbai. I've been planning to run away because my father drinks too much and shouts. But you showed me that fathers can change, that love can win. I'm going to stay and pray for him instead." The stories continued through the week. A business executive in Tokyo called his estranged son for the first time in 20 years. A grandmother in Argentina forgave her daughter for choices made decades ago. Prison chaplains reported unprecedented requests for family reconciliation meetings. In his evening walks through the Vatican gardens, Pope Leo XIV often found Thomas sitting on benches, reading letters that had been addressed specifically to him. People called him the father who returned, and children sent him drawings of families reunited. "I never expected this," Thomas said one evening as they walked beneath the olive trees. "I thought I was just a broken old man asking for forgiveness." "You were," Robert replied with a gentle smile, "and that's exactly what the world needed, to see, not perfection, but transformation. Not a saint, but a sinner made new." They paused by the fountain where they had first walked together as father and son. The water continued its eternal song, just as grace continued its eternal work in human hearts. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. Robert looked up at the stars, beginning to appear in the Roman sky. "Now we keep living it," he said simply. "One day at a time, one family at a time, one heart at a time." In the distance, the bells of St. Peter's began their evening prayer, calling the faithful to remember that mercy never ends. 6 months later, Thomas Post awoke each morning to the sound of church bells drifting across the lake at Castel Gandolfo. The small villa that Pope Leo XIV had arranged for him sat nestled among olive groves, close enough to roam for daily visits, far enough for the quiet contemplation that had become precious to both men. The house was simple 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, with a view of the lake, and a garden where Thomas had taken to growing tomatoes and herbs. On the kitchen table sat a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with letters from around the world that continued to arrive weekly. People no longer wrote, seeking forgiveness. They wrote to share stories of reconciliation inspired by a pope and his father who had dared to heal in public. That morning, as he did every Wednesday, Thomas walked the short path to the village church, where he helped with the children's catechism class. Not as a teacher, he had no formal theological training, but as a storyteller. The children loved hearing about the old man who wrote a letter and the son who chose love over hurt. "Tell us again about the hug," 7-year-old Maria would always ask, and Thomas would describe that moment in St. Peter's Square when 62 years of separation ended in an embrace that moved the world around noon. The familiar black car arrived to take him to the Vatican. These daily visits had become routine, though they never felt ordinary. Thomas still marveled at passing through the bronze doors, still whispered prayers of gratitude as he walked the marble corridors to his son's study. Pope Leo XIV was finishing his morning correspondence when Thomas entered. Without looking up from his desk, Robert smiled. "How were the children today, Papa?" Full of questions. "As always," Thomas replied, settling into the chair that had become his. Young Pietro asked if God has a father too. Robert laughed, the sound echoing softly in the ancient room. "And what did you tell him?" "That some mysteries are too beautiful for words," Thomas said, "but that love always finds a way." They shared lunch on the small balcony overlooking the gardens, talking about everything and nothing the way fathers and sons do when time is no longer their enemy. Thomas spoke of his morning walks by the lake, his correspondence with families, seeking healing. Robert shared the challenges of his papal duties, the decisions that weighed on him, the moments when he felt most human beneath the white cassock. "Do you know what I treasure most about all this?" Robert asked, as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the garden. Thomas looked at his son, this man who had forgiven what seemed unforgivable. "The ordinary moments," Robert continued, "like this, like knowing you'll be here tomorrow and the day after that, like having a father to call when I need wisdom or simply want to hear a familiar voice." As evening approached, and it came time for Thomas to return to Castel Gandolfo, they embraced, as they always did, not as Pope and Pilgrim, but as father and son. "Until tomorrow," Papa Robert said. "Until tomorrow," my son Thomas replied. And in that promise of tomorrow, grace continued its quiet work, proving that some stories never truly end. They simply begin again, deeper and more beautiful than before.